Well, class, in the previous scenario, I gave you the scenario of Pakistan wanting to give Saudi Arabia nuclear weapons. This actually happened in 2013. It was something that Pakistan was proposing in order to limit the power of Iran. At the time, many thought were developing nuclear weapons, and there's quite a bit of evidence that they were at least trying to. Um, and this was really concerning to the U.S. because, unlike the United States, these countries live in very close proximity to each other, and nuclear weapons, it would more or less be very hard to tell if there was a nuclear attack where it came from, especially if it was launched by a missile. There simply would not be enough time to figure out where it's coming from compared to, say, Russia to the United States. So this is obviously something the United States would do, and I guys had some good suggestions. So what are things the U.S. could do? Well, there's a plethora of options, and when we're thinking about foreign policy and diplomacy, we want to think about it in the way of carrots and sticks, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. But we want to think about what the United States could do that would possibly be a benefit to those countries, and we want to think about things that the United States could do that would possibly be a consequence or a negative to those countries. So think of a rabbit. Give a rabbit a carrot, it's going to like it a lot more than a stick, right? So a couple things the United States could do. We'll talk about some of these. They could impose sanctions. Sanctions are economic in nature, so we could limit the trade or make it illegal for people of our country to trade with that country, and we've done that before with Russia and Iran and Iraq. It's funny, if you've ever seen the show Arrested Development, it's one of my favorites. There's a family in there by the name of Blues, and they get in trouble for doing business, real estate deals in Iraq at the time when we had sanctions. So the U.S. is the world's largest trader, so to speak. It's the biggest economy. So if you limit a whole country from trading with another, that could really hurt them. We could take away funding. We give a lot of money to Pakistan for the military. In order to help us in some ways, we could take that away. We could do military action against Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, which would possibly upset them because we use them for support against the wars on ISIS and Al Qaeda, and sometimes we use their military installations for access to other countries. So, and we use Saudi Arabia for intelligence quite a bit. We could also give military support, however, though. This might mean building up the military and therefore prohibiting the need to acquire nuclear weapons. And we can negotiate with Iran, which is in some ways what the United States did do to limit the threat of nuclear weapons. But each of these is really has negative and positive consequences, as I talked about. And it really takes diplomacy to even talk about these sanctions. So what is diplomacy? This is primarily how foreign policy is done. And according to Webster, it is the profession, activity, or skill of managing international relations, and it's typically done by a country's representatives abroad. So it's typically done from one person to the other. And it's very relational. It's the idea of a personal contact of talking to one another. It's by working things out, and it's typically done by ambassadors from one country to the other. So typically done from, for example, the ambassador of the United States going to live in a country for a while and talk with that nation's government and that nation's leader. Typically, diplomats talk about a whole bunch of things, and they could do all these types of agreements between heads of state. They could talk about health and welfare. How are we going to promote health and welfare between our own countries? Sometimes it involves environmental agreements, like how are we going to cut back on the use of plastics, for example, so that we don't pollute the world's oceans. And both countries might, again, offer carrots and sticks to do that. They might offer, one country might offer another money to stop using a certain chemical, and some countries will take that. They talk about trade. This is where we see trade between two countries, and they might want to increase trade so they can open up new markets for their citizens. They might talk about boundaries. Um, we see this quite a bit actually in the South China Sea. It's interesting. China actually built islands to stake territory over area in the South China Sea, but countries might dispute boundaries, and this is certainly something that led to World War II and World War One, right? Like, where does the boundary of Germany and France begin, and what area belongs to each country? And so talking about these things in many ways can prevent war. This is why diplomats must be skillful, knowledgeable, and intentional. They must know who they're talking about. They must know the culture. They must know what that country wants. They must know what that country needs. They must know what would offend that country. This is not something that's trivial. It takes oftentimes people with very advanced degrees to be effective diplomats. And typically they have PhDs. They speak the language. It'd be pretty hard to send someone to China if they don't know Mandarin. So it's not to say it couldn't be done, but speaking the language is going to be helpful. And like I said, they use a variety of carrots or sticks, consequences or benefits, negative consequences or benefits, as in their foreign policy toolkit to get what they want for their country as best as possible. Ultimately, oftentimes these are negotiations, which means that you don't get all that you want, but you get some of what you want, and they take time. Our head diplomat, so to speak, under the president, of course, is the Secretary of State. He runs the State Department. Our first Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson, actually, and that was because he spent much time in France abroad. So if you've seen Hamilton, you'll know that he was the first Secretary of State and went to war there quite a bit. But it's typically done underneath him with ambassadors. Ambassadors are appointed by the president, and there's typically one for each country that we have major negotiations with, and some are more important than others. So the ambassador to Israel, the ambassador to the UK is much more important than the ambassador to Nepal. Not to knock Nepal there, but it's just based on how much negotiation cooperation we do with those countries is more than we do with Nepal. But ultimately, the president is the chief diplomat, as we talked about. We see this at the G8 summit. The G8 is a meeting of the world's largest, eight of the world's largest economies. There's also the G20, which is the world's 20 largest economies, and that's when heads of state come and discuss key issues facing the global economy, and we are indeed a global economy. Other diplomatic strategies are where a country may involve itself in membership in international organizations where these countries pledge to do certain things and act accordingly. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, for example, is where countries sign on to not seek to acquire nuclear weapons or seek to increase their nuclear weapons. And the United States is a member of this country, even though we have plenty of nuclear weapons. We've signed treaties to reduce our nuclear weapons and to reduce our capability in delivering them. We're also in the International Monetary Fund, which delves out, decides how much, in some ways, currency is worth. And this is actually really important because countries trade across different currencies. We trade with England, and sometimes the pound is worth more than the dollar. And so this can inhibit or prohibit a country from trading with another based on how much their currency is worth. South Africa's rand, for example, is worth, I think it's a 1 to 10. For example, Norway, so 10 rand equals $1 US. So they can't buy as much. And the International Monetary Fund is there to make sure that currency's not devalued or valued too much more than it should be. There's also the World Health Organization. This is when countries cooperate to combat health problems across the world. And we saw the World Health Organization took a huge part in the Ebola crisis a couple years ago to make sure that Ebola was not being spread. And if there was ever a zombie apocalypse, the World Health Organization would be the first one to help out. And these are countries that we're a part of. The United Nations is also a big one that we're a part of. The United Nations is key for resolving conflicts. That's the goal before they start. It hasn't always been successful in that, but it's a venue that countries can talk with one another about and have other countries support. Sometimes we engage in public diplomacy. So typically, diplomacy is done from one representative of a country to another. From an ambassador to a head of state, or two ambassadors to one another. Very rarely is it government to government. You have to think about the fact that it'd be a lot for Congress to negotiate with Parliament, for example. It would just take a long time because there's so many people. So typically it's done by one person to one person, actually, and their staff. But occasionally we appeal to the citizens of that country directly. So leaders might write an opinion piece in that country's newspaper. The Olympics actually are a great form of public diplomacy because we're sending out representatives to show goodwill and sportsmanship. And the Olympics really capture that, right? They show people cheering for one another based on the fact of hard work and putting aside differences. And so public diplomacy is when a country or a diplomat appeals to that country's population, not their government. Besides diplomatic tools, in terms of like world partnerships and creating ways that we can talk with one another, there's also economic tools that diplomats have and countries have in their foreign policy toolkit. The U.S. is the world's largest trading country. We have the world's largest GDP, gross domestic product, and when we decide to trade with a country, it's very beneficial to them, and when we get goods from them, it's also beneficial to us in many ways. We can enter into trade agreements. This is where we open our doors to reduce trading barriers between one country and another. This might mean reducing tariffs. It might mean removing taxes that exist on certain products. And we can enter into bilateral or multilateral agreements. A bilateral agreement is an agreement between two countries. So, for example, we have pretty big bilateral agreements with Canada, and when it comes to petroleum and oil. Much of our oil actually comes from Canada, not the Middle East. And we have agreements with them to buy it, and they have agreements with us to sell it. We can also enter into multilateral agreements. This is like the North American Free Trade Act agreement. This is an agreement between multiple countries. So this is something that Canada, the United States, and Mexico have signed on to, and it allows free trade without tariffs or taxes between those three nations. Sometimes we also engage in foreign aid. This can happen in numerous ways through the Peace Corps, for example, or the USAID, where we send representatives. I talked about this yesterday, to other countries to help out building schools, maybe building out wells, teaching. It might mean that we're giving foreign aid to countries to do something for us. So we actually, a couple years ago, interestingly, with immigration, gave money to Mexico to build a wall. It's interesting we talk about a wall, but we gave money to Mexico to build a wall at their southern border because many people are immigrating into our country from Central America more so than Mexico now. So it might be some of that. We might also give military aid. We give quite a bit of military aid to countries like Egypt and Pakistan to help bring stability in those regions and to provide us with intelligence and some ways to counteract extremist ideas. Military aid is really sketchy at times because sometimes we've given money to countries that are wholly that we wouldn't necessarily cooperate with normally. Saudi Arabia, for example, has a terrible human rights abuse, and there's not much we agree on when it comes to our ideologies. But we give them a lot of military aid and, in some ways, access to some of our best military technologies because of the other threats that we're more concerned about. So sometimes foreign policy is more of a dichotomy, and it's contradictory in some ways, actually. Another economic weapon that we might use are sanctions. And sanctions are when we prohibit the economic freedom of another country, or economic ability of another country to trade. This might mean limiting access to loans, or accessing to our markets, or it might mean slapping really high tariffs on another country's goods to more or less make it impossible for them to trade with us. So sanctions can be very harmful and very effective at the time, and have actually been our most commonly used economic tool in the past century. We've used them over 90 times. This is, interestingly though, one thing that caused World War II, because we placed sanctions on Japan, and they were so harmful that Japan felt like they had to attack Pearl Harbor. So sometimes they do result in war because it limits people's ability and our country's access to goods and services. Lastly, we have military tools. At the end of the day, sometimes our economic or diplomatic carrots don't deliver. They don't get what we want, and ultimately sometimes we might enter into conflict. This is inevitable. So there's multiple ways that we might do this. We might enter into conflict by ourselves. This would be unilateral, or we might do it with multiple people or multiple countries. This would be multilateral, and we might form military alliances to do that. And one of those most famous military alliances is NATO, or the North Atlantic Trade Organization. It was formed in the Cold War. It's primarily between the United States and Western European countries, and it's at the time, especially through the Cold War, was designed to protect against threats against Russia. Russia also, or the Soviet Union at the time, also formed a military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact. But this is where today the NATO is now formally mostly devoted to peacekeeping and international threats. So when the U.S. was attacked, there's a clause when you join NATO that an attack on one country is an attack on all. It's kind of the same thing as an alliance, or some of the alliances that occurred, some of the pacts that occurred in World War I. But when one country is attacked another, so when the U.S. was attacked in 2001 by Al Qaeda, NATO actually joined in that fight and went to war in Afghanistan. NATO has also been very effective at preventing genocide, both in Libya and in Bosnia in the mid-90s. So it's more devoted to peacekeeping now, although some people in Europe are questioning that alliance now because the U.S. sometimes acts more unilaterally than it does with NATO, and that's evidenced by the fact that we spend more money on our military than all of European countries combined. But we do share intelligence, and we do share resources and training, and it's not uncommon for the military of our country to train with militaries in Western Europe more specifically. But the goal here is collective security, that we're much stronger together than we are on our own. And like I said, if an attack on one country is greater when you know other countries are going to join in. So there's collective security. We may also join in regional pacts. NATO would be a European pact in some ways, but we also have a pact with Australia and New Zealand, as they do with us. That's similar to NATO. An attack on Australia and New Zealand, we would consider an attack on us, and we would help. And this is, you got to ask yourself, would you want to help your friends? And these countries, in many ways, are our friends, and that's why we join in. But at the end of the day, pacts may not be enough of a deterrent, and we may actually need to take military action. So this can include something like a blockade. This is where ships block a country's access to waterways. The Union was very successful in doing this against the South in the Civil War, and it effectively was successful at crippling the economy. The U.S. did this in the Cuban Missile Crisis, so blockades can be very effective. Our Navy is, in the United States, the most powerful in the world, and an aircraft carrier especially can project strength all across the world. You can use drone strikes. They're going to talk about those a little bit later, but they're very controversial. We can send special operations to grab someone or to to inflict change, and certainly this was done with President Osama bin Laden. Ultimately, you could invade a country. Obviously, that isn't ideal, but it happens, and we can enter into both bilateral or multilateral treaties with another country to have collective security or to negotiate peace. And a bilateral treaty would be a treaty between two nations, multilateral, multi-nations. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about some of these tools in context of a real life example, and then we're going to spend doing a case study on, like I said, drone strikes later. So take piracy, for example. Piracy in the Western Indian Ocean is a huge problem. Pirates from Somalia, which is right around the Horn of Africa, oftentimes go up to cargo ships that are carrying millions of dollars of goods and services and hold them hostage until a country pays them off. And it's not uncommon for them to hold them hostage for years. Somalia is a country that has no government, so we can't really negotiate with them. And if you remember anarchy that we talked about, many of you gave Somalia as an example. So what could the world do? How could we use foreign policy to solve this problem? Well, we could use multiple amounts of economic, diplomatic, and military strategies. Obviously, we could deploy a destroyer, which we've done. And if you saw maybe Captain Phillips, that's what would happen. You can use a destroyer because pirates aren't going to attack a ship if they know a U.S. destroyer is close by. Just not going to work. It's funny, there's a couple YouTube videos online of pirates trying to do that, where they I saw one where they didn't realize they were attacking a U.S. destroyer. They thought they were attacking a frigate, and the U.S. destroyer launched a couple shells over their ship, and they quickly turned around and quickly realized they made a big mistake. And the more presence we have, and other countries have those presences, the less likely they're going to be attacking ships. We could prosecute pirates. If we capture them, we can prosecute them in U.S. courts. We could also provide aid to Somalia, which may reduce the need for piracy. We can form an alliance diplomatically with other countries in the region, and we can provide money. This would be an economic strategy to Middle Eastern countries to strengthen their navies so that we're not doing all the work. All these would help solve a world problem. We certainly don't want people being held hostage from all across the world, and it's one way that foreign policy can actually be really effective and impact the world for good. We have a quiz on today, so if you need to go back and listen to this, make sure you do that. You have 2 attempts on it, and make sure you give it your best effort. And like I said, we'll looking forward to actually doing a case study on drones and seeing if they're effective. Because like I said, foreign policy is one of those things where actions can be both positive and negative at the same time. And so we're going to take a look at that a little bit later towards the end of the week. Hope you guys have a great day, and let me know if you have any questions and need to talk about anything.